Hello, this is Dr. Kevin Garrison with a second video in a series of lectures on user-centered technology and education. Let's recap. Last week we talked about Robert Johnson's Little Orange book, his 1998 text, User-Centered Technology. I argued last week that it was one of the most important texts in technical communication, and I gave a reason for why. Specifically, the reason was as follows. He took James Kenevy's 1960s model, the rhetorical triangle, and reconceptualized it. The argument was as follows. He said that the reader, the reality, and the writer, the three R's, even though the writer isn't quite an R, the three R's are all working together in terms of their power structures and dynamics to create a text. So that when you write a book, there are multiple competing forces at work for how that book takes shape. Now, if you reconceptualize the rhetorical triangle around rhetoric, then you take the reader, and you put the reader at the center, and you put the text at the periphery. And the reason for doing this is because the end of creating a text is not to create a text. The end is to release that text to an audience. And then the audience takes the ideas within those texts and applies it to their own individual contexts, and thereby the power is centralized or decentralized in the hands of the audience. Now, Robert Johnson reconceptualized it a second time by taking the rhetorical triangle and applying it to technological systems. And he did so as such. He said that the text becomes the artifact, the reader becomes the user, the reality becomes the user task and system actions, and the writer becomes the designer. And when you reconceptualize how the rhetorical triangle works through technological systems, now you have the ability to apply rhetorical theory to technology, which for me, as a rhetorician and somebody who studies philosophies and theories of technology, this is very appealing. Today we need to answer a different question entirely, which is why do we have a need for user-centeredness? What's the value of it? I think we can see that intuitively, that it's a powerful concept. Obviously, if you're designing something, the user matters when they're the ones using the pen, just as much as the reader matters when they're reading a book. Makes sense on an intuitive level, but let's branch outward. Let's go to the so-called 40,000-foot view and look at this from the theories of technology and philosophies of technology, which is my field of study. It goes as such. The reason we need user-centeredness is to counter that determinism. Now, technological determinism is something that is rampant in the literature on technology studies. And the reason is because ultimately it all boils down to a question of control. Who or what is in control? Is technology, machines, techniques, are they in control, or are people in control? Which one? Here's a good quote from this book, Did Technology Drive History? They say, people seem all too willing to believe that innovations in technology embody humanity's choice of its future. And this is the question, whether that choice is an expression of freedom or an expression of necessity is the dilemma. So the dilemma is, do we create technologies out of human freedom, or do we create it because of some external deterministic factor which forces us to do it out of necessity? I think we all have a feeling that technological determinism is a real concept. Let me give you a simple personal example. Several years ago I got my first smartphone. I knew when I got it that I was making what I call a substantive life choice. I wasn't just choosing to get a smartphone, I was choosing to make a conscious change in how I use a lot of technological systems. Some simple examples. Up to that point, if I wanted to call somebody, I had the number in my head or I had it stored on a computer somewhere and I had to pull that up and look at it. Now I have an entire contacts list. And if I want to call somebody, I scroll through that contacts list, I select them, and I don't have to actually waste cognitive space up here to memorize numbers, which are very arbitrary and very difficult, especially when you have the area code plus all the digits that follow. That's at least 10 numbers that you have to memorize right there. That's difficult. So this saved me from having to do that, and I knew that when I picked up a smartphone that I was making a conscious choice to change the way that I conceptualized communication. And ironically, knowing that when I went into it, to this day, I can't tell you hardly any phone numbers besides my home phone. I couldn't tell you what my own cell phone number is. I can't tell you what my wife's cell phone number is. I can't tell you what any of my friends' cell phone numbers are. I only simply know one number. And why is that? Because I freed up all that RAM, all that hard drive space to work with other concepts. Another example, I used to use maps to travel and navigate new cities. Now I simply use my GPS. It's built into my phone. So I knew when I picked up a cell phone for the first time that it was on some level going to determine me and determine my actions. And so we all feel on a very simplified level that technological determinism is a real concept. And we see this displayed in media constantly when we read 1984, we read A Brave New World, we read the book Jurassic Park, or we watch the movie Jurassic Park, or we watch Terminator, etc. There's a variety of media that sort of conceptualize technology as running amok or taking control. And so we feel that lack of power. Now, technological determinism determines us in basically three ways, as looked at from Robert Johnson's image here. It determines us from the designer. In other words, the designer conceptualizes who we are and how we interact with technology. The book that we're reading this week is The Design of Everyday Things by Donald Norman. And one of the things that he says right at the outset of chapter 3 is that information, quote, information is in the real world, or information is in the world. In other words, the artifacts themselves have a predetermined way of people interacting with it. The fact that this is a pen that's designed like that, this indicates that I'm supposed to hold it somehow in my hand. It's too small for my toes to pick up. It doesn't really make sense to go like that with it. So in other words, it predisposes us to using it in its corresponding very specific way. And so that information is encoded within the technology itself. Now the designer has to do this, whether it's conscious or unconscious. Here's an example of how a designer can consciously manipulate the determined aspect of how users act. This is a passage from, from The Whale and the Reactor by Langdon Winner. He writes that Robert Moses, the master builder of road, park, bridges, and other public works of the 1920s to the 1970s in New York, built his overpasses according to specifications that would discourage the presence of buses on his parkways, oddly enough. Now, he specifically created overpasses that were 9 feet tall at their shortest point. 9 feet tall, or at their tallest point. Well, why would he do that when obviously you're not going to be able to get a bus or a semi-truck underneath that? His answer is very startling, and it's this. Page 23. The reason reflects Moses' social class bias and racial prejudice. Continues. Automobile-owning whites of upper and comfortable middle classes, as he called them, would be free to use the parkways for recreation and commuting. Poor people and blacks, who normally use public transit, were kept off the road because the 12-foot tall buses could not handle the overpasses. Ironically, of course, that this is a picture from a 2007 accident. Now people use GPSs to navigate, and so when somebody is driving a semi-truck and not paying attention to the road sign, but rather just following the instructions on their phone or GPS device, they get stuck. But one consequence at the time was to limit access of racial minorities and low-income groups to Jones Beach, which was Moses' widely acclaimed public park. So the designer, in a very sadistic way here, has power over how people act, based on the design of the technology itself. Because he designed the overpasses at a lower height, buses were unable to go underneath them. Therefore, poor individuals or minorities were not able to get out, who took public transit were not able to get to the park, thereby reinforcing his stereotype. Fantastically interesting, if not a very depressing story. There's another way that we are determined. Not only do the designers themselves determine us, one way of thinking about it would be the technocratic elite. Designers have power over who we are and how we act and what we do. Second way that we lose power, or we are determined, is through the artifacts themselves. This is Edward Tenner's famous book, Our Own Devices, where he argues that everything that we use on a day-to-day level has a corresponding power attached to it. It determines us on some level. I've read numerous passages from this book to different classes and different students over the different years. Let me read you one about shoe technology. It says the following: people in industrial societies may assume that the tender sole, talking about the sole of the foot, would soon be ravaged by its environment without the protection of footwear. In fact, wearing shoes creates this sensitivity. After a week of barefoot living, the foot forms a protective thickened layer that, unlike calluses, does not generally block the pleasurable sensations of contact with the earth. And 1 billion people on earth still go barefoot. So this is an example of how the artifact itself determines us. There is no conscious motivation, like in the previous example, of a designer stepping in and going, I think what I'd like to do is make people dependent upon footwear so that I can then create a whole entire field called podiatry and then force people to go to podiatrists to get their feet fixed. That wasn't the conscious intention. It was an unintended consequence. But essentially that was an unintended consequence of the artifact itself. So in other words, people put on their shoes because they're trying to protect their feet from their environment without realizing that in doing so, you're actually weakening the foot even further, thereby predisposing you to continue to wear shoes. He gives another example, and a great example, of a chair here. A chair, when you sit down in it, weakens the back muscles, weakens the spine. Therefore, when you stand up later, you go, oh crap, my back hurts, and then you sit back down. Oh, that feels better. And then muscles are weakened even further. You stand up later. Oh, that still hurts. And so consequently, the chair, as he argues, is a tool or a machine for producing dependency upon itself. It is a determined aspect of the artifact itself. So let me give you one more final example. So let's go back here. So these are the 3 corresponding spots here. So we see that power resides in the artifact. We've seen that power resides in the designer. Let's also see how power resides in the reality, which I'm going to call the system, or the context here. This is a passage from Willem Vanderburg, who was a keynote speaker at a conference that I attended a few years back in Rochester, New York. Vanderburg was a student of Ellul and a really good writer. But he has a really interesting story to tell. And essentially the story he's telling corresponds to an idea by Philippe Verdot, which is that technology is not only a problem solver, it's also a problem generator. So in other words, when you introduce a technology, you're fixing one problem, but at the same time you're creating a new problem. This is the story. Vanderburg writes, "A silly story may illustrate the conceptual difficulties the Industrial Revolution introduced. Once upon a time, an engineering student inherited a Ferrari engine from his Italian grandfather, and he decided to mount it to his Volkswagen Beetle, the old-fashioned slug bug. The necessary space was created by removing the back seat in the existing engine, and the new engine was mounted and connected to the rear wheels. When he took the car for a test drive, he promptly lost control in negotiating the first turn. Surprisingly enough, didn't kill himself, because the vehicle was imbalanced and the suspension was not up to the task. He sheepishly took it home to modify the suspension and reinforce the understructure. The car now handled much better, but at highway speeds and in windy weather, the aerodynamics proved to be problematic, and in cold weather, the defrosting system was inadequate. By this time, he had a vehicle capable of making full use of the power of his new engine. He had modified just about everything on his car. In the same vein, building and installing an industrialized production system into a traditional society required so many adjustments as to transform both its technology and its culture. Now let's think on this for a second. There was no problem here. He's got an engine and he's got an old Volkswagen Beetle. The engine is sitting in his garage. The Volkswagen Beetle is probably, I'm assuming, functional at this point. But because he wants to unite these two together conceptually and in reality, he creates a new problem, which is that the engine is too powerful for this small structure. So he has to go back and rechange everything about it. Little bitty slug bug tires, they're not strong enough, they're not wide enough to handle that much power, so I've got to get bigger, fatter tires, something that's going to grip the road better. The structure isn't strong enough to support the engine, the weight of this larger engine, so I've got to reinforce that. And so he has all these new problems that come just because he started to tinker around with a slight aspect of a technological system. And we see this similarly in all aspects of technology, especially in 2017. Let's take a simple example, one that's less story-based and very practical. You go back 120 years ago, people still used horses and carriages for transportation, with the occasional trip on a railroad. And with the introduction of the automobile, the internal combustion engine, it changed everything about the way we conceive of travel. So in 2017, we are dealing with entirely new problems that we were never anticipating, never expecting. We're dealing with problems of air pollution. We're dealing with problems of running out of oil and gasoline. We're dealing with the problem of the production of gas and how to handle that. So that, for instance, individuals buy gasoline, it goes bad in their garages, and they go pour it out on their grass or the weeds and try to get rid of it, which is bad for the environment. Or they take their oil and I don't know how to recycle this, I don't know where to go with it, so they throw it in the garbage can, which then ends up in the landfills. We're dealing with problems of road systems, and we're dealing with problems of where do I keep my driver's license, and how much do I have to pay for insurance, and what's the best vehicle that I can get for the money that I have. We're dealing with all these artificial problems when fundamentally all we wanted to do was get from point A to point B a little quicker. But in getting from point A to point B a little quicker, we've reconceptualized entirely how transportation works. And the irony, as Sigmund Freud pointed out many years ago, is that now because of the vehicle, or because of the automobile, we can live at further distances away from one another, which then forces and necessitates us, hence the word determines, us to continue to do this in the future. The only way that we're going to be able to get from point A to point B is to use a vehicle, because now point B is much further away. So the system becomes a determining aspect of the equation. We've created a problem, we now have to solve that problem, therefore we have determinism. So, to recap, this is why it matters, is because in the process of putting the designer, the system, and the artifact in charge of human activity, we have ignored the most important individual. Me, you, and everybody else in the world. So here's how we get around that problem. This is the quote-unquote solution, but I hate that word because it's a technological term. This is, say, the answer to the question of why user-centeredness, and it's this answer of decentralization. Decentralization is a metaphor, so let's analyze that metaphor briefly. Something that is at the center has the most power. In a physics equation, it works as follows. The sun in the solar system is the largest element. Everything else circles around it in the periphery, in the margins, at the edges. We don't see those. This is the big thing. It's the seen. These are the unseen. So when you have something at the center, it has power. This is centralization. When we apply the metaphor to systems of power, specifically political systems, we can see centralized control in places where the power is put in the hand of a single individual or a single group of individuals or a single group. or maybe a corporation, a company, an industry, etc., a monopoly. So power is centralized when that power is in the hands of a few, not a bunch. So the famous authors of the 20th and 21st century and technological theorists were all answering that fundamental question, is how do we decentralize the power of technology? Lewis Mumford, first example, he said that there are two technologies in history. One is authoritarian, which is a system-centered perspective, and the other is democratic, which is a man-centered. So in other words, we need to take the system out of the center, and we need to put man. He was writing in the early 1900s, early 20th century, so maybe a better word today would be human-centered. Andrew Feinberg, writing in the last couple of decades, in his book, do I have it with me? Questioning Technology, 1999. He wrote that we need to democratize technology. Now, democratization is a political theory, but it works as such, that when you have the monarchy at the center, or the aristocracy at the center, then you have power centralized in the hand of a few. When you democratize in a political system, you put power in the hand of everybody, or everybody who's considered a part of the democratic society. And so, in doing so, you decentralize power by democratizing it. Here's Edward Tenner. We need to have a return to a collaboration between user and maker that marks so many of the great innovations. User and maker. And how do we do that? How do we connect these two people together? Through a collaboration. A collaboration is a conversation between two people. A better word would possibly be a monologue versus a dialogue, which is the way of conceptualizing it. A dialogue means that two people are equals and they are having a back and forth inter-exchange. A monologue is where one person is in power, the other person does not have power, and there is a one-way transmission of information. A monologue. Somebody is talking, the other person is listening. So a way of collaborating in terms of technology, or a way of decentralizing it, would be to allow for there to be a conversation between the people who design and the people who have to use, as opposed to a monologue, a direct transmission from people who make to the people who use without having the user in the discussion. Here's a final quote from Langdon Winter. He said, "The key question is how to come to terms with ways in which our," big word, "technology-centered world might be reconstructed," which is an open question. That is the open question. It's a constant question in theories of technology. It is how do we make technology-centered questions less technology-centered? So what do we want to put at the center? If technology is not supposed to be at the center, what do we put in the center instead? I think for Langdon Winter, the answer would be to think about our lived world experiences. I don't have a water bottle because I care at all about water bottles. That's a technology-centered question. I care about water bottles because they allow me to do things that I wouldn't have been able to do otherwise. When I teach, I get dehydrated. I need to take a swig. I need to unscrew the cap, refreshing. It allows my throat to be less dry, and I'm able to continue my conversation or my lecture. But we don't care about the technology. The tool is just a tool that allows me to accomplish a task. That's not supposed to be at the center. It's not supposed to be the sun. What's supposed to be the sun, what's supposed to be the pool, is the individuals. Maybe the students that we're working with, or the people that we're interacting with. And so how do we do that, he says, is an open question. Well, one answer, the big answer in technical communication, is user-centeredness. And this is a quote from Robert Johnson. He says that we have to turn our attention to the everyday users of technology. That ends that discussion. What we're going to do this week and next week is we're going to read this book by Donald Norman, The Design of Everyday Things. And this book gives us the historical background for how user-centeredness came about, and gives us copious numbers of examples for how this might happen in terms of basic everyday technologies, like our chair, like the pictures on our walls, like the doors we walk through, like the pens that we hold in our hand, like the phones that we dial. He's going to give us lots of examples about how if we bring the user back into the discussion, we take away control from the technocratic elite, from the designer, from the artifact, or from the system, and we put it in the hands of the user. And that's why it matters. I'm done. You know where to contact me if you have any questions. Goodbye.